Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for attending our session today. We're really excited to talk about the future of psychedelics. There's been quite a bit of a resurgence recently within the space, but there's a lot of potential that people have not thought about and a lot of considerations that are quite critical to be thinking about moving forward. So we've put together a fantastic panel today to talk about some of those considerations and what you need to be thinking about as you invest in psychedelics in the future. I'm going to go quickly through a round of introductions. So perhaps we could just start one by one. And Henri, I'm going to put up some slides and perhaps we could start off with you.
Thank you very much. So I am Henri Sant. I am one of the two founding partners at the Conscious Fund. We are the most active early stage venture investor in psychedelics. We have nearly 22 companies in our portfolio already, and we've also incubated 13 psychedelic companies. So we're a broad sector expert, and our focus really is on the financial aspects of the psychedelic medicine market.
Wonderful. Olivia, if you could introduce yourself as well, please.
Thanks so much for having me today. My name is Olivia Mannix. I am a co-founder and chief strategist for Aphrodite Health. We are a psychedelics drug development company focused on pain management as well as mood disorders for women by women.
Wonderful. And Jim will be attending as well. But just to go a little bit into his background as well, he's currently the CEO of Return Health, which is a company focused on developing psychedelics for dementia and neurodegenerative diseases. It's only quite an area of interest, recently given the approval of aducanumab and the recent investment resurgence within Alzheimer's and dementia itself. Suran, if you could quickly introduce yourself as well, please.
Yeah, so I'm Suran. I'm a co-founder of April 19, and we are an AI-driven drug discovery company completely focused on discovering new psychedelic compounds.
Wonderful. And I'm Varun Renjen. I'm an associate principal with Blue Matter Consulting, which is a life science strategy consulting firm focused globally. I specifically lead our CNS Center of Excellence, which is a team dedicated to all commercial considerations within CNS and recently have done quite a bit of work within psychedelics. So with that, CNS has certainly seen quite a bit of a resurgence within the pharma industry recently. A lot of companies such as Pfizer and Lilly and AstraZeneca had started to move away, but recently in the last 5 years, seen quite a bit of a resurgence. It's been the area where you've seen truly targeted therapies like RNA therapies, gene therapies. There has been the recent approval of aducanumab for Alzheimer's, which is quite a watershed moment earlier this year. And more recently, and quite excitingly, interestingly, there's been quite a resurgence within psychedelics. Still certainly quite a taboo around psychedelics, but the therapeutic potential, which has been used in different ways for thousands of years, there's a greater understanding specifically about how it can actually be used to treat a variety of CNS diseases. There are approved psychedelics, and there's been some robust data specifically within mood disorders, but there's a lot of potential beyond what is currently being studied, what's currently known. And those are some of the topics we do want to talk about today. So getting into that itself, Henri, what are some of the risks that are involved in investing within psychedelics? And what are some of the key things that investors should be looking for moving forward?
The most prevalent risk is just the sheer complexity of the projects. We're talking about fixing the brain, which is still very poorly understood. The mechanism of action, the effects of these drugs, there is quite a lot of complexity that is built into each company. It's a complex market. Many people think it's still a startup market, but in fact it's quite mature and there are several hundred participants already. So one of the risks is that you're unaware of the interaction between the company that you're investing into and the broader market, other CNS companies. The risk, I guess, generally is that investors dip into a market that really needs a full-time focus and a considerable infrastructure to consider all these elements that make it complex. that for me, I think, is the most prevalent current risk.
So to that point, certainly we have seen esketamine from Janssen get approved. There's quite robust phase 3 data from MAPS with MDMA right now, and waiting excitingly about the psilocybin data from Compass within the next couple of months. So certainly there's been big players and emerging players in this space. What is preventing this from going more mainstream? Is it just more data, or are there other considerations to make psychedelics more mainstream in terms of day-to-day clinical medicine?
It's still relatively early in its development. It is moving at a very accelerated pace, but you've got to allow for these companies to get through clinical trials. You've got to allow for jurisdictions to open up in terms of new clinics and using base compounds rather than medicines. You've got to allow for more investment. So the sector is moving very quickly towards the mainstream, but if you look at the size of the patient population that could be helped by these drugs, it's vast. And going from 0 to hundreds of millions of patients globally is just going to take time. I think we're at the beginning of the beginning. And as you start to get more drugs into the market, more patients talking, because ultimately it's patient demand that will drive the growth of this sector. As patients start to talk about this stuff more and it becomes normal rather than something unusual to be discussed, it just becomes a regular treatment. At that point, you will have a mainstream psychedelics industry. I think we're several years, maybe 7 or 10 years from that. But most data would suggest that the industry is actually increasing its push towards the mainstream. So there's definitely an acceleration in that direction. And it could happen earlier than there are, many circumstances in which celebrity-driven usage or public health usage, because it's lower cost, could really broaden this into the mainstream much more rapidly.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful point. And getting certainly back to the whole concept of the CNS revolution, CNS has actually become the second biggest book of business for venture capitalists, specifically after oncology. And so certainly this is quite forward-looking. Even if this is 7 to 10 years away, this is potentially a time to start thinking about investing within the space, because the regulatory hurdles are perhaps becoming less, clinical development is speeding up. Certainly a big component of clinical development is actually optimizing the molecules or looking for the appropriate molecules to go ahead and test. So Suran, thinking about that from a drug discovery perspective, what are some of the costs and timings that are going to be critical to be thinking about from an investor perspective as companies or researchers start to look into new derivatives of psychedelics? And how can this process be expedited moving forward?
Yeah, so first of all, I agree with Henri that we are very much really at the beginning of this whole sector, right? So, and I think to answer your question, why don't you see a lot more sort of traction in this space? It's simply time, right? You simply need the time for these compounds to finish their phase 3 trials, which if it all goes well, will happen in the next couple of years. In terms of the kind of the main game, if you like, from the several publicly listed companies, and obviously there's only a handful of these companies. There are about 3 or 4 which are $1 billion plus, but as you know, that's also very small in the sort of broader, pharma market comparative valuations. So, but if you take a lot of these companies, what they're doing is they're trying to do 2 things, right? Either they are trying to take well-known compounds that are open source, doing clinical trials and getting some sort of data privileges or data monopolies for a certain time period. Or the other types of companies, and sometimes they're doing both, is trying to take existing open source compounds and trying to sort of explore that space, that chemical space, if you like, nearby, and trying to create derivatives using traditional sort of medicinal chemistry type approaches, with the view that you can actually patent these new compounds. And once you have a patent privilege of these compounds, then you go through the clinical trials, and then you'll have a monopoly right on these new derivatives for the next 17 years, for example. So that's broadly what's happening in pretty much, I would say, all of the psychedelic drug discovery companies. Now, but then the backdrop to that is obviously what's happening is the whole AI revolution. So as you know, AI is pretty much eating up every industry, that's out there, and drug discovery is no different. So just to give you a very quick statistic, typically, a drug, to bring a drug to market used to take, $1 to $2 billion and about 10 years. But now using this AI methods, this sort of pretty advanced sort of pattern recognition methods, we can go from roughly from an idea on a blackboard to say an initial compound in something like 45 to 50 days. So you can sort of see this sort of speed up in time. And obviously that is correlated also with respect to speed up in the money you spend to bring these drugs from initial ideas all the way to preclinical to compounds that you can take to the next stages. And we think this is going to have a dramatic impact in the whole area of psychedelic drug discovery, just like you're seeing AI in all of the other areas of drug discovery. And in the next couple of years, you'll see, or frankly, in the next few months, you'll see a few big companies going public, as in like AI-driven drug discovery companies that have raised a few $100 million going public. You'll see that, and I think they'll create an enormous amount of value. Those are in general companies focused on cardiology, focused on oncology and so forth. And what we're trying to do is apply some of the best of breed AI techniques, but purely focused on psychedelics. And our sort of bet, if you like, is by specializing in this particular area, you get a lot of domain knowledge, and the chances of us, discovering something unique are much higher. And I think that is proven already with the one client that we have.
That's very exciting to hear. And certainly when I think about that, everyone does think about psychedelics and mapping those very much to mood disorders such as major depressive disorder and PTSD. What is the potential for AI to start elucidating potential clinical applicability of psychedelics for diseases outside of mood disorders?
Right. So let me try and answer that again by taking a step back, right? So if you take civilizational knowledge, if you like, has been very good sort of mechanism over the thousands of years, finding whether it's mushrooms or other plant-based compounds that have worked for X, Y, and Z conditions, or particular that elicit certain responses. Now, and similarly, you've seen, say, the person who got the Nobel Prize in 2015, who actually took a traditional Chinese medicine, and actually that was artemisinin, and sort of took a slight take on that, and produced the most sort of effective malaria drug we've seen ever. So if you take civilizational knowledge, what that means is that you would have a lot of people over time who would have taken different mushrooms. Some of them would have died, some of them would have not died, and the ones that produce goodness, if you like, and what we call a fitness or a fitness function, those things survived over time. And obviously that's why you see these things over the years. Things like magic mushrooms, so forth, which are traditional plant medicines. And what's happened over the last sort of 50 years, particularly people like Sasha Shulgin, who have taken some of those initial points and with very excellent medicinal chemistry have explored that space a bit further. So obviously, MDMA and all these sort of other compounds that he did some amazing work there. And in that case, the fitness function of how good these compounds were frankly him and his wife. They consumed them themselves. Obviously, very high risk strategy too, but that's what they did. Now, so you can see that what they're doing is they're taking these sort of chemical structures, they're taking a carbon bit out, adding a hydrogen thing, and you're sort of searching the space of possibilities. Now, if you look at it from a computational point of view, what that is that you are effectively taking a whole bunch of variables, whole bunch of factors. And in this case, we're coming in slightly from outside, so we can see up to 100 different variables, 100 different factors. And in this case, like say a 100-dimensional space, if you like. And whether it's mood disorders, whether it's pain management, whether it's something else, what you're basically seeing is that a certain chemical structure eliciting a certain response from a, it doesn't kill you, it's not toxic, it's bioavailable, and it docks with a receptor like 2A, and perhaps doesn't dock with 2B, for example. So the way we see it is that, we can search this space, using this technique at such an efficient way. It's almost as if we had like 100,000 medicinal chemists, with us. So what that means is that whether it's mood disorders or whether it's pain management or whether it's addiction cessation, we think we can traverse this whole space really efficiently, really in a profound way, we think. And that is not only for screening existing compounds or finding derivations of this, but also to look at entirely new approaches, entirely new novel compounds using what is called generative AI. So we think we have a whole bunch of tools and perhaps a slightly different philosophy to this whole sector. And we think, we have a slightly new angle to it. So the way to answer your question, I think in all of these things, we don't make much of a distinction whether it's a mood disorder or pain management or otherwise, because ultimately it is a compound that is hopefully new because you can file for patents, but also elicits a response for your desired receptors. And provided you go through those checks, then we think we have a much higher chance of success. Now, saying all of that, this is all computational. It's not the real world. There's nothing like doing stuff in a lab, right? So there's a bit of a disconnect between, what we do using AI stuff and in a lab. So the labs are still super important. But what we're saying is that you can reduce the time, effort, money that you spend in a lab and massively increase the chance of success. That answers your question.
All right, wonderful. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. So certainly one of the diseases you did touch upon was pain management. And that is a disease that has certainly taken quite a big role within society, certainly considering the opioid epidemic and the overdosing that does happen. And there's certainly been a movement to try and minimize opioids, and certainly seen what's happened to a company like Purdue, who did have massive settlements. So there is a need for new treatment options outside of opioids. So Olivia, thinking from that, what are some strategies or what are some of the potential for psychedelics to help treat pain specifically?
Sure. So literature suggests that chronic pain is basically altered plasticity in the brain. And it's actually, thank you for the slides, is basically an intense pain despite the lack of injury. So for instance, if you see the chart on the right-hand side, you step on a nail and immediately you'll get a cut, there may be blood, what have you. Sometimes if you step on a nail, you'll feel pain long after the actual event takes place. And this is surrounding the chronic pain arena. And basically what happens is there is not pain at that time, but it's pain that's long lasting after the injury. So what we found is that this is related to the neuroplasticity in the brain. And if you could go to the next slide, it has been shown that psychedelics actually can increase neuroplasticity in the brain. So basically, there's ways to rewire through neurogenesis the different neurons that actually can keep pain from being chronic and actually potentially reverse it. And that's actually something that we're looking at Aphrodite Health with specific types of pain. And it's really fascinating because right now with chronic pain, opioids are used and then also antidepressants, which really aren't, in my opinion, the best way to treat these indications. So, we're really excited to see how psychedelics can actually really help with the opioid crisis. And actually, last year alone, there was nearly 250 million prescriptions of opiates in the US. So, unlike opiates, psychedelics do not appear to be addictive, and it's a really interesting compound that we're looking at for this neurogenesis to occur. So we're really excited to be looking into this.
Wonderful. And this sounds like this could potentially be almost pre-opioids or help to spare opioids specifically, potentially given in conjunction with something as benign as even like an Advil or acetaminophen.
Correct, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, 250 million prescriptions does still sound like quite a dramatic number, but if you look at the numbers from previous years, that's a number that is quite coming down. And I think that is a number we're going to see continuously to decrease over the next 5 to 10 years. And that potential for psychedelics to help replace the opioids, not just to even treat chronic pain, but even to help potentially treat the addiction to opioids or some of the more illicit versions of opioids is quite interesting as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I mean, you wouldn't think that a psychedelic could have all these amazing opportunities, but it's, again, just showing what an incredible market this is, and it's just a great time to get in.
So transitioning on from pain, which is certainly quite a huge area of focus, especially here in the US, but another area within medicine, especially within CNS, that has always had attracted a lot of interest, and more so recently, is certainly dementia, neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's. There has been an increasing investment sentiment exponentially, especially since the approval of aducanumab within the past couple of months. However, there's still uncertainties and controversies about what actually the underlying pathophysiology is of a disease such as Alzheimer's itself. Given that, Jim, from your perspective, how can psychedelics be positioned in dementia relative to some of the other therapies that are on the market?
Varun, let me begin by thanking you for the opportunity to speak at this conference. And this is an excellent question because, Alzheimer's is generally regarded as a graveyard of a lot of drugs. There haven't been really any successful drugs. There's been lots of attempts. You referenced the Biogen approval recently, which I think is a sea change, tipping point with approvals for drugs. Even though despite the fact that that drug does not appear to be very efficacious, if at all. So really the question becomes, will psychedelics prove to be different or not? And I think that is the main question. And let me say that, it is not clear exactly what the problem is with Alzheimer's, if you want to speak about that. It's believed to involve something with cholesterol transport because patients with a certain genotype, ApoE4, have increased predisposition to Alzheimer's. But beyond that, people don't know. There's obviously the plaques and tangles. That's the pathophysiology. Whether that's a cause or the effect, it's unclear. So there are a lot of unknowns here. But let me address it this way, which is, drugs have to work. They have to work if they're going to get approved and or be used. Okay, so really the question is, will they work or not? And the situation is the FDA doesn't absolutely care that how your drug works or what even the cause of the disease is. The question is really, does your drug help the patients or not? So we at Return Health have chosen to break down the problem into two parts. One is the behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. It's summarized as BPSD. And the other one is cognitive decline. And that's what most people think about when they think about Alzheimer's. They think about the loss of memory, the ability to do simple math, to pay your bills, those type of things. But the behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia are just as important. They're part of the very early stages of the disease. And we're focused on treating that. And I would make the point that those symptoms include agitation, depression, those type of symptoms, anxiety. They're really not different from what psychedelics have already been shown to be effective in particular with depressed patients or patients with PTSD. Psychedelics are highly effective. And if you are familiar with patients with PTSD or depression, it's never a case where they're just depressed or they just have post-traumatic stress disorder. They also have underlying anxiety. PTSD has depression as well. And also psychedelics have been shown to work in cancer patients with those type of symptoms. We think that the symptomology is very similar between dementia patients, cancer patients, PTSD, as well as clinical depression. And that's why we think we'll be successful.
So understanding that certainly everyone, when they think of dementia, always thinks of Alzheimer's first, but there's certainly many different subtypes within Alzheimer's, and oftentimes the diagnosis of Alzheimer's versus, say, vascular versus Lewy body dementia is difficult to elucidate in clinical practice. That to me implies that psychedelics could theoretically help to treat the spectrum of dementia diseases without necessarily knowing which one is which.
Exactly, and that's the point. So, dementia is the umbrella term for a set of symptoms. Alzheimer's is the largest cause of dementia, but there are other ones like frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, as you referenced. And our strategy is to go over the dementia, the umbrella term, and there's a couple reasons for that. It basically is a much larger market because we're not just talking about Alzheimer's, we're talking about Alzheimer's plus all these other types of dementia. And we also, intrinsically believe, because we're not purely a Alzheimer's mechanism, our drugs, we believe, will work through three mechanisms. One is neuroplasticity, which psychedelics, are well known to induce. Okay, so neuroplasticity. The other one is neurogenesis, which is not obviously known about the psychedelics, but they do induce neurogenesis, the growth of nerve cells. The last one, also not well known, is neural inflammation. So when brain cells are dying, there's a lot of inflammation associated with that. Psychedelics are known to reduce that inflammation. So really three targets, but they're not necessarily specific to Alzheimer's, but to dementia overall, and that's why we're targeting dementia.
So with that, I want to thank all the panelists. Certainly, there's been a lot of interest and a resurgence within psychedelics. Everyone started to understand the potential across mood disorders for a lot of the classic ones, such as psilocybin and ketamine. But certainly, there is a much greater potential to use a greater variety of psychedelics across a variety of neurological diseases. And as you move forward and thinking about what's next within CNS, this certainly is an area that I think is going to come to fruition over the next 7 to 10 years across a variety of the different diseases that we've already discussed today. So I want to really just thank all the panelists for all their time and insights. And with that, certainly welcome a Q&A and welcome questions from the audience.
Thank you very much.